Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. This month, EyePatchNotes has set up a parlay that I'm going to subtitle A Wayward Benefit at Constellation 4, or EyePatchNotes says Commitment, Marketing, and the Perception of Blueprints. This is a parlay focused on Genshin Impact's, well, one of their ways of monetizing characters or selling characters. Might be of particular interest to you if that's something that has put you off of Genshin Impact. I might talk about that a little bit because I don't think it should put you off of the game, but it's very understandable, I think correct, really, to be concerned. And this parlay is going to dig into that a little bit from the perspective of how Constellations might be trying to market to the player, or what the method to the madness of Constellations is. EyePatchNotes and I have talked a lot in the past about how the way that a character's passive effects are broken up in Genshin Impact is kind of weird. They're sort of fake, like they kind of don't have them a lot of the time. And this parlay is going to talk a lot about that. Because of the way EyePatchNotes writes these parlays, EyePatchNotes, I hope it won't put you on the spot if I say kind of a way to make their own video through me as a sort of proxy partial creator. I'm, for this parlay anyway, going to choose to just read the parlay as it's written without interrupting it and just kind of present it as best I can and then talk about it myself, almost as if we're doing like a mini video by EyePatchNotes, and then I'm going to react or respond to the video, basically. I'm doing this because I think there's enough I would say differently. I hope that doesn't sound rude in this parlay that it's just going to chop it to pieces if I don't do it that way. And why not let it just be its own thing? There's a lot of bits that, I'll be honest, I think are kind of confusing when presented this way. I feel like it warrants elaboration, and I worry that maybe EyePatchNotes is counting on me to elaborate on those points. So I'm going to try it this way this time. If you don't like it, we can redo it, of course. But I also will elaborate on them. I've written notes about what I would want to elaborate on at the end. So if there's any point that confuses you, I hope we can come back to it and it'll make sense. You, the audience. For EyePatchNotes, I'm just going to read the thing, and then I'll come back and do lots of clarifications. And maybe it won't confuse as many people. Maybe that's just silly. Okay, here we go. EyePatchNotes says, for a direct reply parlay, yeah, we could have some kind of branding for reply parlays. Anyway, Tartaglia, the character Tartaglia, has at once selfish and selfless contributions. Genshin Impact has an unshakable motivation to sell characters and copies of characters, with several demonstrated strategies since the game's public release. Ah yes, several strategies. To establish a baseline, assume each character has the following: a weapon and element, a skill that affects an enemy and generates particles, and a burst that deals damage, instant or over time. Character identities emerge when tweaking the above. A character that buffs themselves with their skill, a character that generates many particles, a burst that helps the party, and so on. The parlay author is intentionally excluding normal and charge attacks from the baseline, as a character without explicit incentive has better things to do. A previous parlay broke characters into 3 rough chunks: the character level 20, level 70, and with constellations. Character trials provide the exact resources to ascend the character once, and any character player sticking with Genshin Impact will not have a character locked at level 20 for long. For accounts of meaningful age, the time spent before level 20 is moot when evaluating a character. Why is this low-hanging passive gated behind the first ascension? EyePatchNotes chooses to believe it is a marketing ploy. By requiring specific player input to ascend, the game dedicates an entire screen to a piece of information. In this way, the level 20 passive is effectively core functionality, delayed just enough to force the player to engage with it. Tartaglia enters the picture very early in Genshin Impact's history with the unprecedented passive Master of Weaponry. Like elemental resonances, in essence simply being in the party, Tartaglia will boost the party's normal and charge attack damage. Field time is the most finite player resource next to Primo Gems, so a character with incentive to stay on the field and quiet benefits off of it is automatically marketable. Among the harbingers of Genshin Impact's monetization, Constellations provide an opportunity to refine and remix a character's inputs and outputs. The model EyePatchNotes subscribes to is as follows. C1 and C2 could be seen as a relaxation of restrictions or adding quality of life, a small increase to damage or flexibility, a light magnification of existing traits. C6 then could be exaggerating an aspect of the character, a strong magnification of existing traits. And where C3 and C5 are the character's skill and burst in some order, getting some extra levels, C4, a wayward benefit that excludes the character or includes the party, new functionality to round out the character perhaps. Players can accidentally acquire Constellation 1 and Constellation 2 of characters when chasing someone else on a given banner, 4-star or 5-star. However, Constellation 4 quickly becomes a measure of intentionality. Like a character's level 20 passive, Constellation 4 is framed within the comparatively bland C3 and C5. Thus, Constellation 4 occupies an island of interest, being the last major change to a character before C6. Here we can analyze a specific marketing goal: how to sell a character to those uninterested. Should players not be motivated by the character's initial contributions, new functionality can be used as a last-ditch monetization effort. Yanfei probably comes to mind, as an on-field damage dealer up front and an off-field shielder in the back. EyePatchNotes considers this a commercially successful, if morally dubious, move to get players to roll on banners that include Yanfei. This stance can be summed up as, "We're sorry you didn't like the character's base kit. Here, if you are not sold on their Constellation 4, this character is not for you." MiHoYo probably. Yes, that's our quote here. Regardless of mechanical text, players ultimately decide how characters will be used. Even a character like Hu Tao, pictured in the background, there she is in the wave, can be used as an expensive Pyro Rosaria in some contexts. Hu Tao grants crit to the party when her skill ends, compared to Rosaria's burst. While there are plenty of characters who do not have a Constellation 4 in this vein, EyePatchNotes prefers a predictable precedent when pursuing possible role candidates. Probably. Okay, a lot as a place to start, but after what you could view as that 7-minute video to start the parlay, I'll respond. I'm first going to respond by kind of summarizing what I at least took. EyePatchNotes is highlighting first that characters, could be evaluated as having a lot of different knobs that could cause them to appeal to you. Maybe you just want a Hydro character to apply reactions. Maybe you have a bow you want to use, and Tartaglia is a bow character. Maybe his skill or burst interests you, or you want particles from them. Tough luck with Tartaglia, etc. There could be lots of knobs. And then the character has a bunch of passives. They get one when they ascend from 20 to 40, or they unlock 20 to 40. Another when they unlock 60 to 70. And then they have 6 constellations. Constellation 3 and 5 are always just their skill or burst talent gaining some ranks. And so we can divide them up into, well, let's assume the level 20 passive is innate. And Constellation 3 and 5 don't bear mentioning because they're always the same. And then we've got Constellation, the talent from 60 to 70, and Constellations 1 and 2, Constellation 4, and Constellation 6. What are these things for? You didn't talk, EyePatchNotes, in your parlay about what the 60 to 70 Ascension passive is like. And indeed, I think it would be hard to say there's any pattern, really. So let's not worry about that for now. But it could be an interesting line of inquiry. The premise of this parlay then becomes that there is some pattern to constellations. Now, EyePatchNotes kind of acknowledges this, but there sort of isn't. There's a lot of examples of characters that don't follow this pattern. And we're not going to worry about that too much, at least for my part of the discussion. I think that it's fair to say that a good number of characters actually do follow this framework EyePatchNotes has suggested. I said at the beginning of the parlay that my thesis is going to be how I kind of think constellations should be thought of as if they basically don't exist for 5-star characters anyway. Things that cost an amount of money to get that no normal person will ever have. And so it shouldn't be thought of as being part of the character. And indeed, I strongly believe that the characters are designed with it in mind, that the constellations are actually not really a thing. Many of them sound like a whole situation, but are actually just a pretty boring damage boost, or they don't really change how you would use the character. Indeed, the way I often describe characters is when I talk about them on the stream, is that I wouldn't ever choose to use a character when I wouldn't have before just because of a constellation I got from them. Yeah, maybe some exceptions for 4-star characters, but even then, there are a few exceptions, but I really do think they're exceptions, and it's easy for our human brains to remember, oh yeah, but what about those characters where there was that big bombastic constellation? What about Kazuha, who at Constellation 2 provides the party with 200 elemental mastery? That's a pretty huge benefit. That is not a light magnification of existing traits, is it? But I actually think it kind of is. We'll get into it more later. I think that a lot of these are illusions. They might seem like a big increase to the character's effectiveness, but in practice, they don't really change the situation. It's quite rare for a character to have a constellation that truly changes what role they would have on your account. But EyePatchNotes gave a few good examples. I think Tartaglia is a good example. I think Yanfei is also a good example. Let's talk about Yanfei briefly. Yanfei is a pyro catalyst character who has these really long range kind of artillery charge attacks. She can drop these explosive pyro seals on enemies from above, from quite long range, and is a rather selfish attacker. She has a burst that buffs her charge attack damage, gives her a damage boost, and generates seals that power up her charge attacks. Her skill gives her full seals for her charge attack, and so she can just wail away at enemies with charge attack spam to be a sort of long-range artillery attacker. She doesn't have anything in her kit besides her Constellation 4 that has anything to do with anybody else in the party except for her. She has a purely selfish kit unless you get 5 copies of her, and then suddenly she gets one thing that is related to the rest of the party before Constellation 6 goes back to being selfish. So when EyePatchNotes and I are saying that C4 is kind of different, that's what I mean, is that the entire character is designed as if that wouldn't be a thing they would do, but then suddenly they do briefly do something that is related to, I don't know, like something very unrelated to their kit is the point. In Yanfei's case, she gains the ability to generate a shield when she does her burst that scales with HP. She doesn't have any other party support or anything else that scales with HP, but suddenly at her Constellation 4, she just does something basically completely different. You could almost view it as a totally different character, suddenly. And indeed, you could play Yanfei, people do play Yanfei, as if she's just her Constellation 4, building her all HP and using her only to generate a actually pretty massive shield. This is not necessarily bad or good. We're not going to get into that. I personally don't think that's great, but it's not nonsensical. It is mathematically reasonable. It's a good shield, whatever. The point is that that really is quite separate, and there are lots of examples of this. Diona randomly has a thing on her Constellation 4 that makes her charge attack really fast. Nothing in Diona's kit even remotely rewards you for even building damage, let alone charge attacking ever. And then suddenly her Constellation 4 gives you a kind of a throwaway benefit for doing that. Now, the interesting thing is that these are often powerful numerically. It doesn't necessarily mean the character is suddenly good at that thing, but because they were usually completely irrelevant at it before, it often makes a substantial difference. Like for Yanfei, that shield is so large that that on its own kind of makes her feel like a substantial team support character by itself and encourages you to build that way for some people. Diona, maybe not so much. It depends, but it is a very separate benefit. I really want to emphasize, especially if you haven't played Genshin Impact, how dramatic these sometimes are. It's not always their Constellation 4 ability. Again, I do think for Diona, for example, her Constellation 6 gives you an elemental mastery buff, pretty big one too. That's a pretty big right turn from the rest of her kit. She doesn't really have anything that enables damage, let alone elemental mastery. It's a little weird. I actually think that's a great constellation, sure, but it is a little odd. And again, for people who play Genshin Impact, let's not get hung up on how, yeah, it's not always their Constellation 4. Maybe not every character has something like this. All right, sure. But to be fair, there are lots of examples of that thing, right? So EyePatchNotes' thesis then, coming back around, is that this could be considered a way to kind of sell the character to people that are not that interested. If you just happen to get some copies of a character, the Constellation 4 could be seen as a way to sort of push for this thing. The developers are kind of making an educated guess that people who don't want a character would never naturally get their Constellation 4. Obviously, it's possible, but it's extremely unlikely. Really, very unlikely. They might have done math, for example. You could do math and see how this lines up. That if a player wants a character that's a 4-star on a banner, how many copies of that character are they likely to get with how many copies of the banner's 5-star character? In other words, maybe that's around 3 copies. And then the developer might think, okay, well, what if we treat Constellation 4 as like kind of a different character? And maybe the player didn't want Tartaglia, ends up with 3 copies of him, but then sees that his Constellation 4 is basically completely different, and then considers getting him because of that effect. And as EyePatchNotes points out, yeah, this is statistically true. It has been effective. I think that's morally frustrating that they do that, but it has been effective. They've shown that characters that have constellations that the player feels at least meaningfully transform their gameplay have sold much more on their banners. So it does work. Like, objectively, it is a successful strategy. Whether or not this is most of why it's successful, we can't really know for sure. The developer doesn't really know for sure, I would argue. But we know from statistics that they've released that it does work. We just don't know exactly how much or exactly why. But the idea of constellations driving banner sales is a thing that occurs. Like, that is a fact that we know. It shouldn't be, just by the way, a little aside from the Zanypants side of this parlay. Yeah, like, most of them don't matter at all. They're just a damage increase. A lot of people focus on how they're not literally a damage increase, like directly a damage increase. For example, a recent character who sold a lot of copies on their banner was Farazan. Now, Farazan is a 4-star character that enables animo damage, and she was sold alongside the Wanderer as the 5-star that is a powerful animo attacker. And because 5-stars get a guarantee, you know, if you save up enough, you just will get them. The game gives you pity, we often call it. And a relatively low pity compared to similar games, by the way. You end up in a situation where, yeah, like, as a free or cheap to play player, weirdly, the 4-star characters become the matter of concern because you can be sure that you will get a 5-star you wish to get, provided that you prepare enough. In other words, right now, I'm looking for Al-Haidam, an upcoming character. I really want him. I don't have to worry about gambling for him. I can't anyway. I don't have the money, and I don't consider that acceptable. So I'm not going to gamble for him, but I don't have to, because once I have enough Primo Gems stored up, I can just roll enough on his banner, and the game guarantees me that I will get him after a certain number of rolls. And I've calculated out how many that will be, and if I have that amount of Primo Gems, I will get him. Done deal. Now, a trick in Genshin Impact is that the 4-star characters, while much more common, you are technically never guaranteed any specific 4-star character. So, for example, on the Wanderer's banner, we had, who was it? Farazan, Yanfei, and... I don't really remember, but anyway, 3 characters is the point. Rosaria? No, I forget exactly, but it doesn't really matter. The Wanderer, who you could have been guaranteed to get, maybe who you wanted. After all, the game puts a lot of focus on him. Has another character on their banner, Farazan, who is explicitly designed to be a support for him. They're very intentionally designed together. Farazan's kit is designed to directly lock into the Wanderer's kit. Not only... It's not like she's only good with him at all, quite the opposite. A pretty versatile character overall, but let's be direct, a lot of players that might not occur to them. They might not be thinking of Farazan as a very versatile character. They probably think of Farazan as being the Wanderer support, right? That is wrong, well, just reductive, really. It's actually quite correct if you want to think of it that way. She absolutely was explicitly designed as a support for him. But the player may not notice that, you know, actually, I can't really be guaranteed that I get that character. But surely I will, right? And you hear stories about this all the time, actually even in other games. It's the lower rarity characters, which you occasionally will just get unlucky and not get, that are often what get people. Because they get into this mindset where, like, that character should be easy to get. I'm saying this because I think it's one of the most, maybe the most predatory aspect of these games' monetization. And I play Genshin Impact partially to make these things better known so that you do not fall prey to them. So here we go. We have to talk about this. I mean, we basically just did a quick like a band-aid. You got to beware the 4-star characters. When I pilot my account, partially for work, I focus on getting 4-star characters because they are objectively more common over the long term of rolling on an account. Like, more people will randomly own a 4-star than a 5-star. But individually, they may actually end up being harder to get since you can't actually guarantee that you will get a copy of them. You're just very likely to get a copy of them if you roll a lot on the banner. Very likely, by the way, like really, really likely. You basically will get them, but that's how they get you, that kind of thing. So Farazan, the point is, a lot of her constellations are very meaningful effectiveness increases. Her first constellation, when she uses her skill, she can fire a wind arrow that sucks enemies together. In her first constellation, you get 2 uses of that. You get to fire twice as many, if you want to think of it that way. A big effectiveness increase, but is that really anything beyond just sucking enemies together more times? Is there any team where you wouldn't be wasting uptime for other characters' abilities by using that? Yeah, I guess so, maybe, but ultimately it just makes her, maybe you could say, more flexible, or you have more to do if you run out of other stuff on your team that needs doing. It doesn't make her able to do something different in terms of gameplay utility. It just allows her to do something she already could do more. A lot more, but just more. Same thing with her Constellation 2. Her burst goes from 12 to 18 seconds. Now, these are dramatic increases. She gets twice as many wind arrows. She gets a 50% increase on her burst duration. So you can see how people rolled a lot on this banner because they felt like those were really good. They made the character complete, they thought of it as. But really what's true is that a lot of people probably just got 3 copies of Farazan while rolling for the Wanderer, and then it became common to say, oh, she feels really good, and people saw that that player had 3 copies of her. It then becomes common knowledge or understanding that the character is only complete when you have those constellations. After all, they're such basic parts of their kit, increasing their duration, maybe to match a character's effects, right? Xiao, for example, another Anemo attacker, has a burst that matches up quite well with Farazan's constellation augmented burst duration. So you could think of it as she doesn't really match up with him very well unless you have that constellation. But is it actually bad if you don't? Like, does that make her not a good choice if you don't have it? In fact, how long does the effect of her burst last after it affects you? Well, it's about 4 seconds. And so if the duration is 12 seconds, and the effect lasts for 4 seconds, then it's already 16 seconds. Who cares if it's a bit longer? And then you're just going to stop attacking after 18 seconds anyway, because Xiao's burst will be over. So does it really matter that much? No. And my thesis for the end of this parlay is that the developers very intentionally made it so it doesn't actually matter, but it looks like it matters. I believe that is very intentional. My conspiracy theory, and there's some conspiracy theories in this parlay, is absolutely that. I don't think that's conspiracy theory at all. That's just something I think they obviously do. The constellations are mostly designed to not actually matter, but to really look like they do. And then the character's kit is carefully designed so that they don't really matter, so that there will be people... I'm not doing this now, but in the past I have, which was a mistake. People like me who will argue, oh no, but it's not a big deal, which actually kind of contributes to the trick. It's important to be aware that that is a strategy that they are using. The character is often built in a way to mitigate what seems like a huge benefit from one of their constellations, so that the game works fine whether you have them or not. But it sure seems like it wouldn't unless you get more copies of them. And indeed, this is not always true. I do think it's true that Farazan feels a lot more sensible in some team compositions if you ever see one versus you don't. Tartaglia is another kind of weird example. So his Constellation 1 decreases the cooldown of his water blades by 20%. Now, the way Tartaglia's skill works is basically when you use it, you get a cooldown proportional to how long you used it for, and a big punishment if you use it for too long, but you can keep it going for a very long time if you so choose. The cooldown just becomes kind of crazy. If you want to put him in a rotation on a team, this makes Tartaglia, as one of his strengths, pretty flexible. It means that you can keep him out for about however long you want, 10 seconds or 20 or 15 or whatever amount you want, and then he gets a cooldown that is about proportional to that time. So as long as you have a team that plans to have a different attacker for about half of the time, you can make Tartaglia work in that team. It actually doesn't matter that much how long that attacker wants to be attacking for, which is a unique strength. Not that many characters are good at that kind of thing. They often would be good half of the time, but they can't choose how long that half is. You see what I mean? 20% cooldown off of his skill is, I would say, as someone who's been playing this character for a long time, that is not enough to make or break any particular rotation for this character. Players usually, most players, the average player, even relatively skilled or experienced players, simply don't rotate tightly enough for it to matter that the cooldown is reduced like that. It basically just means that one time out of 10, where you swapped back to him too early, it just won't be too early if you have this constellation, which is an almost unnoticeable quality of life. You see what I mean? It seems like exactly what you'd want, because the only thing limiting him is his cooldowns, right? But in practice, it just doesn't really do anything. Same thing, I think, with his constellation too. In a lot of situations, building him as an attacker, it's actually not that much damage to do his burst. So generating a lot of energy, but only for himself, rarely makes or breaks whether he's effective on a team, but it sure sounds like it would be very effective. After all, his skill doesn't generate much energy, and his burst does a lot of damage. Now, in practice, if you actually compare the performance one way and the other, it doesn't really make a big difference, but it seems like it would. I know it seems like a long tangent, but this is where we finally come back to the Constellation 4 effect. Now for Tartaglia, this is a great example. His Riptide effects, he marks enemies when he attacks them in certain ways. These normally only do damage when he hits them with certain other effects. And then they do a sort of cleaving bit of slashes that do hydro damage to enemies in an area. His Constellation 4 makes them trigger on their own from time to time. And that trigger doesn't interfere with the other triggers, so they have separate cooldowns or whatever. Suddenly, and for pretty much the only time in his kit, he gains powerful team support. He can now mark an enemy and just leave, and they keep taking damage. They keep getting hydro applied to them, something he had no way, not even remotely a way of doing before. He didn't do that at all, and now he's a little weird, but interesting at it. He has Riptide that lasts for quite a long time, and so if it triggers every 4 seconds and you get, what is it, like 20 or 30 seconds? It's a long time. His mark lasts a long time. You get a lot of hydro application and damage out of that, even if he's not on the field. Now, how easy will that be to work into a team? That's kind of a topic for another time. I have this constellation, and I have personally found it to be very powerful, but not as a substitute for having hydro application. It doesn't happen often enough. Let's not get into that too much. I think it actually fits the theme of a lot of Constellation 4 or Constellation 4-like constellations, that it be kind of bespoke to actually use. Like what you're actually meant to do with this, the game says, I don't know, if you figure it out. But it's powerful. It's a powerful effect. It's just like, but where do you do this? Like why, you know? We're going to get back to a few more examples. I actually think that's quite intentional. Again, it's sort of like a different character. Tartaglia does already have that Master of Weaponry passive, his unique utility passive that increases his team's normal and charge attacks. And because he only has his water blades up for about half of the time, it's very desirable to have some team support because he fits perfectly with another attacker who will probably use their normal and charge attacks, which he increases the damage of, and do some kind of element, or there'll be reactions going on. So having his C4 to add to those reactions with a bit more hydro application is great. It fits him very well. It's not bad. I mean, some of the characters, random Constellation 4 is just kind of bad. But this one, it's clearly relevant, I guess you could say. But it's just sort of weird. It's something different if that's something the player wanted. Another thing I'd like to add that EyePatchNotes you didn't really get into is that I've read about or seen, heard, spoken to, experienced a few of my friends, players who just don't play the character the way the character is, not to be rude, but like very obviously designed to be played. That's fine. It's no big deal. Again, not to be to say that that's the wrong way to use them, but they're definitely not playing the character the way that they are meant to be advantageous. So Tartaglia, for example, if you swap him in and attack for only a few seconds and then swap him out, he doesn't really offer much on his own anyway. If you were to have his Constellation 4, though, and apply that Riptide mark and then just leave and let it do its thing, that's actually not bad, suddenly. So another way to view the Constellation 4 is if you are playing this character wrong, suddenly that's not so wrong anymore. Maybe. Again, Yanfei is another example. What if you're not staying on the field, taking advantage of her damage buffs for herself? She doesn't say she does anything else. I don't know why you would do that, but maybe you literally didn't read her abilities. You don't find it fun to play her that way, etc., etc. Or you don't even have her built and you just swap her in now and again because you like her. Her Constellation 4 suddenly makes a lot more sense. Now, they don't all fit this way. A lot of them don't have any clear through line of like you're playing the character wrong, so then suddenly that's good. And again, I think it's reductive to say that that is wrong for Tartaglia, certainly. I think that suddenly becomes relatively effective. But I do think it's an interesting perspective. I am increasingly, to summarize, more and more sold that the character's Constellation 4 is indeed kind of like another attempt to pitch them to the character, because they're so different. They're kind of counting on you not wanting to use the character the way that the game has suggested using the character in the character's trial, for example, where you get to try them out. They're not built for that thing. So the game is kind of counting on you apparently didn't like that, so let's just give you this too. And usually these effects are so irrelevant to the character's kit otherwise that it kind of doesn't matter. Like if you liked them, it's not going to interfere. You just sort of get no passive, or it's effective but just not a big deal. For Yanfei, for example, if you plan to play her the way you're supposed to, or the way the game suggests playing her, what everything else that her kit is good at, having a shield when you do her burst is good. It just probably won't be a particularly huge shield, but that's not bad. It still feels related, I guess. Tartaglia gets just more Riptide damage. That's fine. It's not really a big deal if you're playing him the way the game has already pitched you playing him, but it's not like bad or something. It's good. It's not bad with his Constellation 2 effect. Yeah, sure. Right. What else do I have to say? Do I have notes? Yeah, to just get a little bit more into my thesis about the constellations not really mattering, you can give lots of examples of characters that have constellations that really don't do anything, that are literally just you get a damage number. I, somewhat notoriously from the stream audience, I have 6 constellations on Dillik. Dillik is one of the characters you can get if you don't get the rate up character. The first time you might not get them, but then the second time you're guaranteed to get them. And I happened to get Dillik among the characters you can get instead of the rate up character 7 times, which is a lot for a cheap to play account. For a player that doesn't whale on the game, that's a lot. I was saying before, for most players, you might as well pretend those effects don't exist because you will never get them. I am the 1 in 10,000 player who ended up getting so many copies of one specific 5-star without whaling for them that I just ended up actually having those effects, even though they would normally be out of reach. It's very unlikely. That's very rare, but it happened to me. Dillik is perhaps the most boring character to get that on, because almost all of his constellations literally just say a damage number that he gets an increase of. He does more damage to enemies above or below a certain health threshold. He gains attack when he does his skill, and that builds up, or whatever. When he takes damage, he gets a little attack speed, but like things like that. They are literally all just like he gets a damage number. None of them really introduce any unique functionality to his kit. Now, you might play him a little bit differently from getting those constellations. I do, actually. And I think that's a kind of softer version of this Constellation 4 thing. His Constellation 4 and 6 kind of fiddle with the rhythm of his normal attacks. Brief crash course on Dillick gameplay. His skill is a pyro damage combo, kind of like a normal attack, but just that does pyro damage, and you can hit it 3 times in a row for 3 hits. Now you can space them out, and then the ability goes on cooldown. And they animation cancel his normal attacks, and his normal attacks will kind of animation cancel these. So what gives you the best damage is to go generally normal attack, skill, normal attack, skill, normal attack, skill, normal attack. And you're canceling the end of the animation for each thing, which gets you additional damage. Now his Constellation 4 gives you a benefit if you wait a little bit before doing his skill again. Now, this happens naturally from time to time. Maybe you're going normal attack, skill, normal attack, skill, normal attack. Ooh, I should probably dodge that attack from that enemy. You dodge. A few seconds pass because you dodged, and then you would have done his skill again anyway, but this Constellation 4 effect gives you some bonus damage. It's a good effect, you'll get a little damage out of it, sure, but actually stalling on purpose to wait for the hit, like doing 2 normal attacks and then his skill, often that actually isn't enough time, and in my experience, it isn't much of a damage increase. A lot of the theory crafters say something similar. It's not that effective to deliberately play into it. But you could, and it will happen from time to time. If you don't use his normal attack and skill like clockwork, a lot of it might be, if you don't really play him the way the game suggests you play him, you might find these to be relatively effective constellations. And then his Constellation 6 does something weird. It makes it so his normal attack chain isn't interrupted by his skill. So when you go normal attack, skill, normal attack, skill, normal attack, skill, like that, you're actually progressing through his normal attacks. You don't just reset to the first normal attack over and over, because by Constellation 6, hopefully the player has realized that's a good way to do damage. When you get to that point, it ends up being not a terrible idea to normal attack, skill, normal attack, skill, etc. And I believe that trait actually gives you an attack speed and damage increase for 2 normal attacks every time you use a skill. I forget exactly because I do this so much now. Which perfectly fits, or almost perfectly fits, with his Constellation 4 that you got before. So now there's this kind of different rhythm suggested. And you can see people that have Dillick's incredibly uncommon Constellation 6 because it looks different. You can see that his normal attack is continuing past the skills that would have been interrupting it. Which is, I think, a thing about Constellation 6 effects too. The developer has an incentive to make it look a little different if you get there. Also, maybe to make it less boring. The player who has a Constellation 6 on average probably didn't get it in one go. They probably didn't roll on one banner one time, one day, and get 7 copies of a character. That's extraordinarily unlikely. You either have to be filthy rich, or you had saved up an absolutely ungodly amount. I mean, it's really not within the realm of possibility. So the developer may assume that this is also to keep you interested if you like the character. I think Constellation 4s could be viewed that way too. This is something that keeps the character fresh. If you have been playing the character a long time and you like them and you rolled for more of them, you just get more stuff. And it's designed such that it's quite extra to the character's performance. You're not going to get success out of them or not based on whether you have this, 9 times out of 10. Again, there's a few corner case examples, but almost 100% of the time, that's, that would be how it was. And I really want to emphasize that point before we go about what I mean by a character's constellations, like secretly not mattering. I'm going to use Nahida as an example here. Nahida is a Dendro character that has the ability to share a lot of her elemental mastery with the team. So she can give a very powerful elemental mastery buff, and because her skill marks enemies and triggers an application of her element when you do a reaction, she's really good at enabling reactions because you don't actually have to put her on the field for very long to get a lot of reactions out of her. She has a constellation, I believe it's her second constellation, that makes it so her mark basically lets reactions crit. She enables the ability to let them crit. You can't build for them critting. She has a set 20% crit chance, 100% crit damage, which is good and bad. You don't have to build anything separate. But it's a unique damage multiplier for reactions, right? That's totally new functionality, right? But if you had Nahida, would you not have used her to enable reactions before getting that? No. And what does it do? It just gives you more damage. It gives you more damage in a unique way, like mechanically, technically. But does that actually matter? Would that change when you would choose to use this character? No. I would say in all likelihood, no. Even if you didn't have that, she just gives more elemental mastery and applies more dendro than all of the other dendro characters. So if you wanted that functionality, you would have picked her already. It wouldn't be because, well, I mean, the player might choose her because they mistakenly view it as being some unique effect. Don't get me wrong. But does that actually make her more powerful in context? No, I would posit. And because the game only has a certain slice of very difficult content, you could say Spiral Abyss, and the developers have all but confirmed that they don't intend to add more, the game very clearly intends you to not need that level of effectiveness. It might be nice. I do think it's part of the game's less savory side, that they're trying to bait you into thinking, oh, maybe it'd be easier to do Spiral Abyss if I just rolled a bit more for this character. It probably won't make it that much easier because ultimately your effectiveness will come from the team working as a whole. But it's not like it wouldn't help. I mean, I actually think it doesn't make a big difference, but that's the trick, right? And so I agree, ultimately. I think that it is a marketing thing. I don't think it's limited to C4, but I think that that is a good way to frame it. Like a useful way to think about it is that Constellation 4 is kind of emblematic of that trend. So overall, pretty compelling. I think an interesting, useful perspective. I think there's something else to say about the Ascension passives that we're not going to get into too much. But if I were to continue this parlay, something I think would be interesting to talk about is the way in which some characters are just simple. And so their passive effects are broken up so they have enough constellations, so they have enough Ascension passives. The developer designed a character and wants a character. That's a key thing that I would want to get into more. That is simple. They're not. It's not like they didn't come up with anything else, and so the character doesn't have enough stuff to say on their passives, so they just spread it out. The developer intentionally made a character that is simple. They're not like unable to come up with more effects or something. It's just not good for them to have more effects. It's good for them to be simple, crisp, elegant characters. You could then say what's bad is that they just have to have that many passives. Every character has to have 4 Constellation 1, 2, 4, and 6, 5, 6 Ascension passive 1 and 2, so 6 passive effects listed on them. So the developer has to put something in 6 places, no matter what the character is designed to do. Maybe it'll be easy. Maybe the character has lots of knobs to turn, and it's super easy to set them up. Or the character is just really weird, and so there's lots of different things you could have the character be good at. For example, I think Farazan, in a lot of her roles, it's pretty irrelevant that she gets 2 wind arrows from her Constellation 1, but there are other ways you could use her where that is relevant. And so because she's a relatively multifarious character, it's easy to give her something to put in 6 boxes. You see what I mean? Whereas other characters, it's quite intentionally not that easy to find something to put in 6 boxes. And whether or not those are separate effects or just putting a passive somewhere else is kind of up for debate. I just think it's interesting to note that part of the incentive behind Constellations and Ascension passives may simply be to add what seems like an expected level of detail or effects that you can unlock to an individual character. And while we should always highlight that a character is designed with their Constellations partially to encourage gambling, that is a thing that they do, it is also considered to be a desirable, progression curve. You will get copies of the character over time. So the fact that you do unlock something as you go isn't an entirely creatively bankrupt way to provide player progression. It's just, it exists that way so that you pay a lot of money, which you shouldn't because it doesn't actually matter. But it's useful to recognize, like, when people say surprise mechanics and they're really just talking about loot boxes. Like, yeah, that's predatory doublespeak. Obviously, it's just gambling. But it would be disingenuous to suggest that surprises like that in games are, like, not fun. They are. That's part of why they work as predatory monetization, but not calling them gambling is predatory monetization. It doesn't mean they're magically not fun. That's why people enjoy them. Perfectly healthy people can like the surprise of opening a booster pack of cards, for example. It's not unhealthy to enjoy mild gambling. Like, that's okay. That's kind of the problem, is that it just is fun. It's not some kind of flaw to enjoy that. That's a thing that is enjoyable for most people. And so that's the rub, that's how they get you. I just think it's worth mentioning that Genshin Impact has another tension there, which is that alongside needing that framework, or as they view it, to make money, there's also the fact that characters have different amounts of complexity, intentionally. Lots of characters are intentionally made without much to say, not much to put in those 6 boxes that need to contain a passive. So how do those characters, Constellations and Ascension passives, compare to characters that do have a lot to say in their boxes? I would say Tartaglia, as an example, since he's here, just to close up, is an example of a character that doesn't have much to put in those boxes. Relatively balanced example. His Constellation 1 and 6 kind of don't do anything. Again, they just fiddle with the cooldown on his skill in a way that you probably wouldn't use if you were using him that much. His Constellation 6 against small enemies, there might be something there, but his Constellation 2, again, I think in practice, it doesn't really change his effectiveness. And then it's really that Constellation 4 effect that is really the only actually new effect on any of his 6 passive boxes. The other ones, his 2 Ascension passives, are basically just Riptide functioning the way it functions. That has been spread out across 3 text boxes. His normal attack has the main description, and then you technically unlock the other 2 parts of it, but you'll just get those by leveling him past level 60. So he doesn't really have any passives except the Constellation 4 effect, but they have to put something in those 6 boxes. Now compare that to a character like, what's an example we've given? You could say maybe Farazan. I think Diona isn't a bad example too. I guess those characters are on my mind because it's hard to think of lots of examples off the top of my head where, they have meaningfully different effects, even if they're not really more than just the damage increase, or maybe they're not even that good. So for example, Diona's Constellation 4, firing her charge attacks faster while in her burst isn't powerful, but it is indeed a different effect. It's definitely something different. That's definitely a new ability. Is that just part of her burst? Is that just a passive that her burst has that they took out and put on her C4? I don't know. I think to me it doesn't feel like it is. But then for Tartaglia, having his Riptide last longer, that's one of his Ascension passives. Well, that feels like it really is just part of his Riptide passive, right? So where do you draw the line? That's a weirdness. I think that another unsung aspect of this confusion is that the developer's threshold of where, what counts as a separate effect from a passive, and the player's threshold for what counts as a separate effect that they unlocked, rather than just part of a passive they already have, it differs. That's difficult to get right, apparently. It doesn't seem like it'd be difficult to get right, but apparently it is. A lot of the time, EyePatchNotes, other people on the stream, we found ourselves saying, this isn't really a passive, though. They basically don't even have a passive, which is fine. They might not need that. That doesn't mean they're not powerful just because they have less things. That doesn't matter, necessarily. But it does feel a little frustrating sometimes when something is listed in a place where sometimes you get a new ability, but you don't feel like you got a new ability, And so again, there's a tension between that, the constellation thing for monetization purposes, and then, again, just having something to put in those boxes. There's a tension there if you wish to design characters of different complexities. To put it another way and to finish up, you could think of it as, by having those 6 passive boxes, every character has to have the same relative complexity, or the player will feel disincentivized by certain Ascension passives and constellations, which there's a financial incentive to make the player not feel. Which means you're going to want to chop up the character's kit in a way that makes it feel like they unlock 6 different things, even if they kind of don't. You see what I mean? Which is very frustrating. Much larger topic that we're not going to talk about at all would be the heading that the game's monetization hurts the game in ways that maybe the average player doesn't realize. This wouldn't be a thing that the game did if the game didn't need to be monetized. If somehow we lived in a utopia where the game didn't have to make any money, or where they just accepted that they'd make less money, the game could be designed in a way where you didn't have these things for every character. But it isn't, because they do want to make all the money, or whatever, they need to make some money. I'm not sure I totally accept that. Could the game just remove that stuff and still make tons of money, but just less money? And wouldn't it be fine? Well, we don't know. And the developer, the publisher, doesn't know. Does the board of directors that just cares about money really know that these things are required for the game to make all the money? Would they really notice if the developer, who I'm going to assume, give the benefit of the doubt, wants to make a fun game, just made it better, but less lucrative? Would they really know that? Is the out of touch, money grubbing board of directors guy really saying you need to have there be 6 passive boxes on every character? Do they really understand that? I think no. But then there's an intermediary, the publisher, who kind of does understand that and relatively doesn't care as much about making a fun game. And so that's where the compromise happens. Is that what happens? I have done a lot of things that resemble game development, but I haven't done anything that resembles being in that part of the industry. So I don't know. I bet yes, but I don't know. It's interesting. I think that this is the only maybe responsible way to play this type of game. You need to engage with why it is doing what it's doing and be ready for it to attempt to manipulate you a little bit. That is, if anything, the worst part of these games. I said at the beginning of this parlay that I was going to talk about, for people that are maybe wary of Genshin Impact because of its monetization, I was going to talk about that. I hope you feel like I did address that in some interesting way without derailing from what EyePatchNotes is interested in. I hope I did that. This was a long parlay because I had a lot to say. I thought it was cool. But yeah, I would say that's the takeaway. For me, it's important to realize that the game knows that the player is thinking about whether the game is pay to win, is basically the elephant in the room term. The game knows the player is worried about that, a lot of players. The game isn't ignorant to the market force. It's not because the game is being a beautiful angel that cares about your well-being. It's because the game is aware of the market force, that if the game is termed as being pay to win, if the game is actually pay to win, that will be bad for the game's sales. The developer probably thinks of it as being bad for the game being fun. And I know it's oversimplifying to say the publisher is only a money grubber and the developer only cares about fun. But what can we do? We have to simplify somewhere. Obviously, it's a compromise between both sides. Someone cares some amount about fun and someone cares some amount about making money. The game is aware of both, okay? Fair enough. And for what it's worth, I think for this type of game, Genshin Impact certainly is a compromise, one of the compromises ever made. Anyway, the trouble for me isn't that the game is going to be pay to win, because that is basically suicide. Almost no game is actually pay to win. Like, no game that tons of people play that's actually really good is just magically pay to win and players don't mind, right? If you think about it critically for a moment, you really think that many people are that stupid? Like, some people want to just throw around their money and be better than other people. There are moderately popular games that are pay to win. Like, the original Arcade was definitely pay to win. It was pay to win. It had game design that was not bankrupt of creativity, but it was pay to win. It was just pay to win. That game was also only moderately popular. It was not a gigantic smash success because being pay to win is not market accessible. Like, that is a market force, right? Very widely popular games are not pay to win. You don't have to be like afraid that they somehow are pay to win. There will be a way that they are not pay to win because it is more marketable that way. The trick is that the game is going to try to trick the player into thinking it's pay to win a little bit, and then there's going to be a way it actually isn't pay to win, but it might be an incredibly convoluted way, basically. For Genshin Impact, for example, I would say it's a relatively positive way, because part of the way the game isn't pay to win is that the game has genuinely creative and meaningful mechanics. You have to actually use elemental reactions to do good damage. You can't just buy an expensive character that is more powerful. I would argue the expensive characters aren't even more powerful, and technically you don't have to gamble for the 5-star characters. So The game definitely isn't actually meaningfully pay to win. It doesn't feel pay to win. You can pay to get a thing that is powerful, but that doesn't mean that the game is defined by you paying money. And again, that's, of course it isn't, because that wouldn't be marketable. Most people don't have a lot of money, right? The problem, the thing I wanted to emphasize, is that the real cost for a game like this isn't that you actually have to pay a lot of money. You don't. You sort of categorically never would. That like isn't actually a thing. I think people don't ever engage with these games and believe this thing that there's tons of pay to win games, tons of really pay to win games out there. There isn't. The problem is that the game does pay a cost for making money that way, right? Like there's parts of the game that are convoluted in a way they wouldn't need to be if the game was monetized differently or not at all somehow. Does that make sense? That is a thing I wish I could impart to people, and that is why I got so excited about this parlay, because I think it begins to touch upon where the convoluted nature of the game, which isn't even necessarily bad, isn't pay to win, is still frustrating, noticeable. It does still change the game, and that is the real cost that these, monetized in this way games are. You could say gacha games or whatever you want to word it as. I think that's incredibly reductive and unhelpful. But games like this, where game pieces are something you can pay to get, the game will be made with great effort to be a not pay to win experience. But that doesn't mean that there's no cost. That doesn't mean it's just fine. It's not pay to win though. So if that's something that you might enjoy, when I say pay to win, I just mean it's not going to be a game where you will feel like you can't do well and get at the content if you don't pay money. That is not a thing it is. It is designed very, very elaborately to not be that way. And we've talked for the past hour, about how, why, what, who, what, where. But I have to get off now because I'm popping off about this whole thing. I hope that was interesting, helpful, maybe. I sort of co-opted this parlay to partially be about that. I think it is about that on some level. And I just think that topic is very interesting. I think breaking it down this way, as EyePatchNotes has, is pretty compelling, actually, on some level. And indeed, I think that when constellations aren't balanced this way, it is some tension of getting a little greedy with the marketing, trying to get players to consider like Constellation 2 of a character to be kind of the base version of the character. Stuff like that. When in fact, they're almost always literally just damage numbers that you don't need. It's fine. Don't let the community convince you that you need that thing. You don't. Anyway, that's enough of that for now. A fun parlay. I hope you enjoyed it.